Trump set for China tariff announcement on Thursday. Trade war fears grow. Washington, President Donald Trump will announce tariffs on Chinese imports on Thursday, a White House official said, in a move aimed at curbing theft of U.S. technology and likely to trigger retaliation from Beijing and stoke fears of a global trade war. There was no indication of the size and scope of the tariffs, which U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said on Wednesday would target China's high-technology sector and could also include restrictions on Chinese investments in the United States. Other sectors, like apparel, could also be hit. Tomorrow the president will announce the actions he has decided to take based on U.S. TRS 301 investigation into China's state-led, market-distorting efforts to force, pressure, and steal U.S. technologies and intellectual property, the official said. The White House said Trump would sign a presidential memorandum targeting China's economic aggression at 12:30 p.m. on Thursday. The investigation by the United States under Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act has identified theft from and coercion of U.S. companies to disclose their intellectual property as well as purchases by Chinese state funds of U.S. companies for their technology knowledge. Lighthizer told the House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee, a top economic panel, that the aim would be to minimize the impact of any tariffs on U.S. consumers. China has threatened to retaliate by hitting U.S. agricultural exports if tariffs on Chinese imports worth up to $60 billion are announced by Washington. The remedies, in my judgment at least, would be 1. Doing something on the tariff front, and 2. Doing something on the investment front, and then perhaps other things, said Lighthizer, a lawyer and veteran trade negotiator. The United States runs a hefty goods trade deficit with China of $375 billion. Estimates of the cost of counterfeit goods, pirated software and theft of trade secrets could be as high as $600 billion, according to one study. Talk of a global trade war emerged earlier this month when Trump announced hefty tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, aimed at hitting Chinese overproduction, but which could also affect key allies, like members of the European Union. Lighthizer conceded that China would likely hit back with measures on U.S. agricultural exports, particularly soybeans, and said if that happened, Washington would impose countermeasures, although he said that nobody wins from a trade war, a stance that appeared to put him at odds with Trump, who has termed trade wars good and easy to win. Since taking office, Trump has taken a hard line on trade, abandoning a 14-nation Pacific Trade Pact and threatening to pull out of the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. He has also attacked Germany, saying it hides behind tariffs to win an export advantage for its car industry. The administration has been forced to walk back some of its steel and aluminum measures, granting exemptions to Canada and Mexico, and entering talks with the European Union and others to discuss potential exemptions. China steels itself for response. China has already identified agriculture as a U.S. weak point, and has said it would target soybeans, a $14 billion a year business. America's farm states heavily backed Trump in his presidential election win. China does not want to fight a trade war with anyone. But if anyone forces us to fight one, we will neither be scared nor hide, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said. If, in the end, the United States takes actions that harm China's interests, then China will have to take resolute and necessary steps to respond to protect our legitimate interests. The European Union's response to the threat of steel and aluminum tariffs also targeted areas where Republicans are vulnerable, threatening Harley-Davidson motorcycles, which are made in House Speaker Paul Ryan's home state of Wisconsin. While China has stepped up its rhetoric, it is far from clear that Beijing is ready to take the next step and move to an economic confrontation that would pit the world's two leading economic powers against each other. Financial markets reacted to the Trump steel and aluminum tariffs with an initial sharp sell-off, although they have since regained their poise. A global trade war would have much harsher economic consequences, possibly hitting the dollar. U.S. stock markets and currencies as varied as the Mexican peso and the Australian dollar, according to analysis from investment bank Morgan Stanley. A targeted use of Section 301 that covered $60 billion of Chinese high-tech products could see a response from China that is relatively muted, the bank said in a report, with agriculture and transport equipment being hit in return. This would have a moderate impact on growth in both the U.S. and China, it said. The risk of an escalation in which there were a broad-based tariff across a range of Chinese goods followed by a response from Beijing that was commensurate with that would cause a hit to U.S. and Chinese growth, a rise in U.S. inflation, and possibly prompt China to take domestic action to boost growth. U.S. seeks China trade moves on autos, financials, chips. Source: Washington/Beijing. Top Trump administration officials are asking China to cut tariffs on imported cars, allow foreign majority ownership of financial services firms, and buy more U.S.-made semiconductors in negotiations to avoid plans to slap tariffs on a host of Chinese goods and a potential trade war. A person familiar with the discussions said these were among the asks from Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer as they pursue talks with Beijing. The Wall Street Journal first reported the demands from U.S. officials, saying they came in letters sent to Beijing last week. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro confirmed that President Donald Trump asked Mnuchin and Lighthizer to try to resolve trade differences with China. We're hopeful there that China will work with us to basically address some of these practices, Navarro told CNBC television. U.S. stocks surged on Monday on the news that the two sides were talking after a massive rout last week when Trump announced plans to impose tariffs on up to $60 billion of Chinese imports over alleged misappropriation of U.S. intellectual property. The Dow Jones Industrial Average (DJI) posted its third biggest point gain ever, rising 669.4 points, or 2.8%, to close at 24,202.6, while the broader S&P 500 SPX rose 2.7% after a nearly 6% drop last week. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang earlier on Monday said that China and the United States should maintain negotiations and repeated pledges to ease access for American businesses to China's markets. Li told a conference that included global chief executives that China would treat foreign and domestic firms equally, would not force foreign firms to transfer technology, and would strengthen intellectual property rights, repeating promises that have failed to placate Washington. Despite a steady stream of fierce rhetoric from Chinese state media lambasting the United States for being a bully and warning of retaliation, Chinese and U.S. officials are busy negotiating behind the scenes tariffs to proceed without agreement. In an interview aired on Sunday, Mnuchin told Fox News that he was pursuing an agreement with the Chinese for them to open up their markets, reduce their tariffs, stop forced technology transfer. These are all the things we want to do. We are proceeding with these tariffs, we're not putting them on hold unless we have an acceptable agreement that the president signs off on, Mnuchin added. China has offered to buy more U.S. semiconductors by diverting some purchases from South Korea and Taiwan, the Financial Times reported, citing people briefed on the negotiations. China imported $2.6 billion of semiconductors from the United States last year. Chinese officials are also working to finalize rules by May, instead of the end of June, to allow foreign financial groups to take majority stakes in Chinese securities firms, the Financial Times said. I anticipate that for political reasons it would be logical for China to respond, because countries do. Blackstone Group, BXN, Chief Executive Stephen Schwarzman told Reuters on Monday, on the sidelines of the Beijing conference, where Li spoke. That's why I view this more as a skirmish, and I think the interests of both countries are served by resolving some of these matters. China called on World Trade Organization members on Monday to unite to oppose Trump's proposed tariffs targeting alleged intellectual property theft, saying they should lock this beast back into the cage of WTO rules. On Friday, China responded to the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum by declaring plans to levy additional duties on up to $3 billion of U.S. imports, including fruit, nuts, and wine. China could also inflict pain on U.S. multinationals that rely on China for a substantial and growing portion of their total revenues, said Alex Wolf, senior emerging markets economist at Aberdeen Standard Investments. This could put U.S. companies such as Apple, Microsoft, Starbucks, GM, Nike, etc. in the firing line, Wolf said in a note. China can increase the regulatory burden on U.S. companies through new inspections and rules, ban travel, stop providing export licenses of key intermediate goods, raise the tax burden on U.S. multinationals in China, or block U.S. companies from the government procurement market, he said. Car tariff differential. The Trump administration has demanded that China immediately cut its $375 billion trade surplus with the United States by $100 billion. China has a 25% tariff on U.S. cars, and has talked recently of lowering it, while Trump has often complained that the U.S. import tariff on passenger vehicles is only 2.5%. China's imports of U.S.-built motor vehicles totaled $10.6 billion in 2017, about 8% of the country's overall U.S. imports by value, according to U.S. government data. On the reported offer to increase U.S. semiconductor imports, it is unclear how U.S. chips would replace South Korean and Taiwanese chips, since there is minimal overlap between U.S. chips and those of the two Asian producers. China is heavily dependent on foreign semiconductors, one of its biggest import categories by value. That said, the United States accounted for just 1% of China's total semiconductor imports last year by value, according to Reuters calculations based on Chinese customs data.